All right, another category we need to keep in mind is gender. Um, Much like race, women and men in minority groups can be internally divided by social class and other factors. Um, just because you're part of a racial category doesn't mean that there's not a unequal distribution of power within the racial category. Males most likely have more power than females um, within the category that's African American or Native American. Um, in this class, rather than discussing women as a separate group, we're going to focus on the divergent experiences of men and women within each minority group. This of course, allows us to get at what Patricia Hill Collins was talking about in reference to the matrix of domination. Um, this idea that race, ethnicity, gender, and class all overlap and they cross cut each other and um, they favor some while disfavoring others. And they create this really intricate web um, of characteristics that define your social position in life. And we cannot understand inequality or minority group status without understanding this matrix of domination. Much like race, the social construction of gender is also a reality. Um, there are traits that we typically say are male versus females. Women are more emotional, men are more physical. Um, and because we are in a society that structures itself in reference to dominant minority relationships, we see this played out in males and females. Now, I'm not saying that there's no differences between men and women. There are sexual differences between the two groups. A male has a penis, a woman has a vagina. That's a difference. But the roles that are attributed to those penises and vaginas over time, that is socially constructed. And it's much in reference to the power distributions in our society. The ideas of what is appropriate gender behavior varies from time to time and society to society, which is another reason that we understand this as a social construction. And the social nature of gender roles is further illustrated in the relationship between subsistence technology and gender inequality as well. So if we look back into um, pre-industrial society, we see a greater inequality between men and women than we do in industrial societies. Industrial societies are more defined. Your position's more defined based on uh, your ability to work, educational levels. All of these things can be found within both men and women and have been made available to both men and women. And as a result, social inequality is decreasing. And today we see it blowing up in our societies today in reference to sexual harassment and society is clearly going through a change in reference to how we view men's superiority over women's inferiority. Prejudice is an important concept that we really have to unpack a bit. This is the tendency to think, which is the cognitive behavior about other groups in a particular manner, and to attach usually negative emotions, which is the affective aspect to other groups. What prejudice really is thinking. I think this group is this way because I learned it on TV. It's stereotypes. It's generalizations. And these vary quite a bit across categories. So, but it's important to remember that prejudice is thinking. This is what I think. It's just different from discrimination, which is action and doing something. When we think about dominant-minority relationships, four concepts that are important: prejudice, discrimination, ideological racism, and institutional discrimination. Prejudice is the individual level, that thinking and feeling. Discrimination is at the individual level, the action associated with those thoughts. And at the group or societal level, we're talking about thinking and feeling is reference to ideological racism, and the actions of discrimination are institutional discrimination. Some causes of prejudice. One is that prejudice is a primary result of being raised in a racist society and interacting in many social situations in which discrimination is approved. It's a learned behavior. It's generally viewed as arising out of intergroup conflict, dominant-minority relationships. Once the dominant assumes control, it starts to structure a narrative that favors that control. One common factor that seems to account for the origins of all prejudices is competition between groups. We see that a prejudice is more of a result of the competition than the cause of the competition. We see this in the Musa Sharif's Robbers Cave example that they talk about in the book, where you take a group of boys that have no reason to have any conflict with each other, you separate them into different groups, you establish identities, the rattlesnakes versus the eagles, and then you set them on some competitive tasks where they're competing against each other. Over time, their thoughts about each other start to change, and their willingness to construct the other as bad, inferior, superior is increased. So as they compete, they begin to see each other as us versus them. And once that belief that it's us versus them starts to take hold, it's really difficult to move ourselves away from that. We really need to think about this, folks, because competition is a major characteristic of capitalist societies, and the more we compete, the more conflict we're going to see in our societies. Some limitations are individuals who have no material stake in minority groups' subordination can still be extremely prejudiced. Another is the sources of prejudice can be found in culture, socialization, family structure, and personality development, as well as politics and economics. And prejudice can have important psychological and social functions independent of group power relationships. Prejudice is not one that's easy to get rid of once it's established itself within societies. I always tell my students, it's not just white people that are prejudiced. All groups are prejudiced. It's amazing what people will say when you're in groups that are all the same group. A group of white people are much more willing to engage in prejudiced statements than if the other was present. And it's the same for Hispanic groups and blacks and so on and so forth. Prejudice originates in group competition and some sort, but often outlives the conditions of its creation. Myrdal talks about this in his proposed idea that prejudice is perpetuated through time by a self-fulfilling prophecy, or what he referred to as a vicious cycle. So you have the contact situation where the competition initially happens. One group wins, the other group loses. The group that loses is given an inferior status. Over time, the group that wins creates a prejudiced or a racist perspective of that inferior status group. It results in discrimination, and it perpetuates the inferior status. Something to think about here is this is partly to motivate the construction of a system of racial stratification and partly to justify its existence. Individual prejudice and ideologies of racism are invented and accepted by the dominant group. These individual prejudices are reinforced by the everyday observations of the inferior status of the minority group. The fact that the minority group is in fact impoverished, enslaved, or otherwise exploited just confirms and strengthens the attribution that they are inferior. This belief in inferiority motivates further discrimination and unequal treatment, which reinforces the inferior status. As you can see, the product or the process continues to operate and the groups continue to be discriminated against. So the idea that the prejudice is learned during socialization is reinforced by studies of the development of prejudice in children. We see this over and over. Children acquire prejudice even when parents and other caregivers do not teach it overtly. We see this also in social distance scales like the Bogardus scale. Research using these scales demonstrate that prejudice exists apart from individuals and that it is passed from generation to generation. The importance of the social situation in which attitudes are expressed and behavior occurs is also important, as what people think and what they do is not always the same. We really need to understand that the Bogardus scale shows us that people are willing to accept difference if it's far away from them, but the closer it gets to them, the less willing they are to accept that difference. There's some limitations to this theory. No two people have the same socialization experiences or develop exactly the same prejudices. That's because we're raised in different situations. No two situations are unique. Everybody's different, but the patterns affect groups in general. Socialization is not a passive process. We are not neutral recipients of a culture that is simply forced down our throats. We have much more choice today, now with social media and other forms of media, to express ourselves in ways that we could have never done in the past. And we also learn egalitarian norms and values as we are socialized. Whether we practice them or not is to be seen. Another important concept is modern racism. This is brought up in reference to the idea that the harsh, blatant forms of prejudice present for most of the U.S. history have become muted recently. And for many, they thought that they had disappeared altogether. However, we're seeing that that is not the case. Modern racism, in some respects, has taken on a much more muted form. It's expressed in much more ephemeral ways. But at the same time, especially with the election of Donald Trump and the ideas of us versus them, make America great again, the more muted expressions of racism that we've been seeing recently are becoming unmuted, and we're seeing some more harsh, blatant representations of prejudice and discrimination in our society.